Hi, everyone, and welcome back to me and Kyle, coach and physical therapist, just talking all things running. I'm from Divergent Rehab. Kyle is from Freedom Run Club down in Florida. We are having two totally different weathers right now. I'm sure you're getting some more weather, and we're up here in the 20 degrees snow. So,
Yeah, it's definitely, we have a resurgence of summer here. I think it was 85 degrees when I came inside not that long ago. As you can see a little bit behind me, it's some nasty pouring weather, but yeah, definitely different
oh,
from what you guys are experiencing.
yeah, I would take that in a heartbeat. Well, so today I thought we would dive in and talk about intensity. But before we jump into the topic, Kyle, I know we've been talking about our online school community. I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of where they can find this. And if you hop down to the notes section of this video, you'll be able to, there will be a link there for the community. Within that school community, it has a lot of resources, educational, there's stories, cases, articles, anything you can think of. So go there, check it out. And you can also comment too and let us know if there's anything that you would hear or learn from us.
Lots of great information there. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so let's dive into it. How to determine or set the intensity of workouts. So let's start with how you would define intensity, and I'll jump into what I typically see on my side of things.
Definitely, yeah. So there's so many different things that you can find in terms of paces. There's apps and different things where you can plug different things in. And as people have probably come to find whenever I'm talking about something, a lot of times it depends on the person, your situation. There's not one size fits all for any of this. But typically when I'm looking at intensity for anybody, I always am looking typically toward what energy resupply chain are we using essentially? Are we training something that's more aerobic? Are we training something more anaerobic? Are we looking something that's more strength related depending on what we're doing? What is the focus of the training, right? So
Mhm.
whenever somebody and especially someone who's more of an experienced runner maybe might come to me, they might say, "Are we going to train 400s?" And to me that doesn't mean anything. That's just the distance we're running, right? I can train easy pace 400s if I have a very short break. I can train all out 400s where you need a ton of rest in between. So really you want to really figure out is what is being trained, and there's that law of training specificity. The system that's being stressed is the one that's going to improve, right? If
Mhm.
you're trying to get a strength run in, doing an easy recovery run doesn't make sense, right? So really you want to look at what is being trained that day and making sure that you're specifically training it, because again, the system that's being stressed is the one that's going to adapt. The system that's not being stressed is not going to necessarily adapt. It could be recovering from something else, but that's really what you want to ask yourself is what am I training today? Why am I doing this? What am I trying to improve? And that's where you kind of want to figure out what your intensity is. And there's more scientific terms for that. You've heard threshold runs, double threshold runs is becoming really trendy out there, VO2 max. There's different more scientific ways of looking at it. Um,
Mhm.
Zone training, all of these things are talking about the same thing in specific ways. I usually like to refer to it in the more scientific terms, things like VO2 max, aerobic power, aerobic threshold, because those are more transferable. If you've got one person using a Garmin pace threshold, might be different than something else. But I always really, at least for the athletes that I'm training, I want them to really know the more scientific way of looking at it so that it's very transferable. Even if they're working with me, not working with me, they can take that terminology and go with it. That's how I like to look at it, is really what are we trying to improve? What is the goal for that workout? That's how I'm really setting intensity. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do that depending on the person that we're going to get into here today. But that's usually where I really want to start is what are we trying to stress? What are we trying to improve with that training that day? And that's where intensity comes from for me.
Sure, because when you think about what you're preparing for, so if you said, I mean, even 800 meters, 60, I mean, there's just everything under the sun. It's going to be a little different from how you set the intensity for a half marathon, right? When I think about your longer distances, your intensity, just because that's generally what I see a lot of half marathon and marathoners more than probably your track and field. Although I am getting a little bit more of the high school group that do a little bit of both. So it's interesting for me just to see how they train differently for that longer distance, setting that intensity, how you set that right for your workouts and how you would monitor. So when you are taking someone through how to figure out their intensity. So do you do VO2 max for everyone, would you say? Or just depends on the person?
Depends on the person, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm a big believer. I think the most common way of doing it is with heart rate, because I think heart rate is probably the easiest thing. Most people have a heart rate monitor on their watch. It's
Yeah.
easy for someone to maybe put a training plan up online or something that they can sell to a bunch of people. It's easier with heart rate because it's
Mhm.
just something that is more accessible to people that maybe don't have a coach or a program or something like that. But it's not nearly as doesn't move as quickly as some of these other fitness indicators, right? So I typically, for say maybe most people, say 80% of the people I work with, I want to know what their VO2 max is. And for people, VO2 max is when you are running at an intensity, or VVO2 max, the velocity where you reach this intensity, is the pace that you is the fastest pace you can run aerobically. Anything faster than this pace you can only do with more anaerobic contribution. So that energy system being stressed, because your aerobic system is tapped out. That's why it's VO2 max. The V, the volume of oxygen, is maxed out, or the usage of it is maxed out. So that's kind of like somebody's 100%. So when I know that for somebody, I can set different percentages based on that. So physiologists have figured out that most people will run, say, their 5K at a percentage of their VO2 max. Your marathon pace is at a percentage of it. Your easy runs are going to be at a percentage of that. And that's usually what I set up for somebody. I program it for them in the app that I use and everything, and it'll actually make that all sort of very easy for them to see. But that's sort of the best way to do it, to set some really good parameters in terms of paces, right? So
Mhm.
when you're doing that, that's something that's going to adjust in small, say 3 to 4 weeks, people are going to see improvements. So you change that. And there's different ways you can test VO2 max. And anybody watching this, if you look at field tests for VO2 max, and if anybody is young enough to be watching us to know this, if those beep tests or those pacer tests that they do where you run back and forth, that's a version of a VO2 max test. Or if you have kids that have done that, that's pretty popular in middle and high school now to test people's aerobic fitness. That's a type of field test. But I want to have something that actually tells me what is their pace that they're reaching VO2
Mhm.
max. So you can do a mile test, a 2 mile test. There's different protocols for it. 5K races can be great ways of doing it. You can do it based on time. So that's a conversation I have with my athletes. What do you think you could give best effort in? Is that a race, 5K race? Is that going to be running for 10 minutes as hard as you can? And whatever the best, it has to be max intensity for it to really be accurate. If someone is doing 70%, well, then it's not going to be accurate. But that's a great starting point for people that can do that.
Mhm.
However, I work with a good amount of people whose goal is to finish races. Maybe they're trying to run a couple miles continuously, maybe go from couch to 5K. That's not really an appropriate way to set intensity from somebody that maybe can only run for 2 to 3 minutes without a walk break, right? So for
Mhm.
those people, we're really looking more at RPE, rating of perceived effort, because that's really something that anybody can do. You make sure that they really understand what that looks like. I know this is something that's super common, and I'm sure you use with your patients and everything in the PT clinic. 10 being all out race pace, one being very, very low intensity. Where does this sort of lie? An easy intensity is going to be in that 2-ish range. Somebody that's lesser trained, it might be up to that 3. So you're giving a lot more flexibility when you're using RPE. So someone that's just getting started, that's probably their starting point, right? And then you
Mhm.
build them up to where maybe they can do a full test run and graduate to having some of these more things going on. But you're also using heart rate intensity all the way through. So there's different things that you're doing for different people. And I can break that down definitely a little bit more. But I would say the gold standard for most people, you're going to want to know what your VO2 max is so you can really set accurate paces if you're someone who can do a VO2 max test. If you're somebody who's really starting your running journey, you're going to want to look at more of an RPE to really make sure that you're not doing too much while you're where really the difference between someone who's just starting easy pace and race pace is not that different, right? So it doesn't really make sense to do all those different specific paces because you need someone to be comfortable running on a more regular basis. Again, those easy intensity and race pace are pretty much the same thing when you're just getting started. So working within a situation to where you have guidance, making sure that you know where you are in those situations and not rushing the process, right? There's nothing wrong with being in that area where perceived effort is the best way to do it. Training yourself where you are is where all of this comes down to. VO2
Mhm.
max is figuring out where are you today and how we can move you forward. If you can't do a VO2 max pace, that's fantastic. Let's start with where you are now, because the best way we can progress through all these other things is training you where you are now and not trying to skip those steps.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And everyone understands their heart rate, right? They know that
Right.
it goes up when you're walking, especially when you're wearing a smartwatch. It's telling you everything. It's at the top of my watch right now and just tells you kind of where you sit, and when you start moving, you can kind of keep track of it. And it can tell you too if something's off, right? I've had instances where I've woken up for a race and I shouldn't have run it, but I was just my head hurts. I just don't I'm not sure what's going on. And I get to the race and my heart rate's already at 100. I probably shouldn't do this. It's hot out, but maybe it'll just feel better, feel good. It'll come down as I start going. And then it jumps into 170s. And I'm all right, done. We're gonna walk. So and then I think I got sick the next day, right? So I think it's a good indicator of something going on. And
Yes.
I've had that happen many times. And I even make my patients aware of that too. Nothing you need to be, it's a fine line because people can really get into these metrics and it can drive them crazy. So it's you don't want to keep track of it too much, but it is good when you feel off to look at that heart rate and see what might be going on. And maybe this is a day that you should go lower intensity if you were planning on a high intensity workout or a tempo run or whatnot. So I think heart rate is a very easy way to figure out what's going on and how your workout is going for you.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was gonna say when I do this, I typically what I'm doing for someone that can do VO2 max testing to figure out accurate paces, percentages of it, I'm using all three of those things essentially. What I want to do with
Mhm.
somebody is when they get started with me, I want to do a test run within 2 weeks, if not sooner, to figure out where those paces are. It also kind of helps look at maybe there's a training gap somewhere in there. If someone's been running 50, 60 miles a week and their VO2 max is not that much more, then I know, oh, it's intensity that we do actually need. That's pretty uncommon, but it gives you some good indicators, right? So you have some paces, some pace ranges. But then there's a general idea of where your heart rate should be in those zones, right? So
Mhm.
the general rule of thumb is for those easy intensities, these are very movable and the data changes on it all the time. But the old school would say under 140, over 120, under 140 is an easy zone. This is kind of lacking in true nuance. If I'm dealing with, say, a middle school athlete who I'd be working with, their heart rate is naturally going to be higher. So I need to know that. And even for me in Florida, I just throw the 140 out and say under 150 because it's just like,
Yeah.
even on our cool days, it's not nearly that cold, right? And if it is, your heart rate's going to go up because you're not used to it. So there's general parameters. You get into a marathon pace. They would say that ideally you're running your marathon at about 155 heart rate. So over easy, but not until that 160, 170, where you're just churning through carbohydrates because of the intensity going up. Something we've talked about in previous videos here, the amount of where your sources of energy are coming from. But what I do is I usually set those paces and then I'm looking at heart rate to see, is there something indicate is something off? Is there stressors happening here? If someone is in their easy run zone and I see that their heart rate is consistently going over, say, 150 as an adult athlete, not somebody that's maybe in their 70s, not someone that's in their teens, your average middle-aged person, if their heart rate's consistently getting over there, there's something off, right? Are they getting overly stressed by work? So it's also a warning
Mhm.
sign that you can look at. But then, Julie, there are people whose heart rate's just naturally higher too. So there's that whole thing, overly simplistic, that idea of your max heart rate is 270 minus, I don't even know what the conversion is because I don't even look at it, but
220.
yeah, whatever it is, right? But it's
Yeah.
so overly simplistic. It doesn't work for most people. And that thing
Yeah.
too about, obviously, the older you are, your max heart rate goes down. That doesn't change with training effect. There seems to be no real, that's a biological thing. And as your heart rate, if your heart rate can't get higher, you can't run at higher intensities. This is why
Mhm.
your sprinters tend to be younger, your marathoners tend to be older. This is part of the progression of someone's training throughout their whole life. But essentially, you have to, the more you work with somebody too, either you're looking at your own data or if you have a coach, the better it is. Because I have an athlete, she's a late 20s, can run under 255 in her marathon. Her heart rate's always 160. Doesn't matter what she's doing. It is
Mhm.
always 160. And it was really, well, at the beginning, it's like, well, what's going on here? I don't get it. These paces, she's able to do it. Her race effort is not going to be it doesn't really make sense based on it, but man, it works for her, right? So I'm not super concerned when she's 160. I'm glad when it gets lower, but that's also looking at long-term data with this. So this is again when I say it depends. So this is where the RPE is going to come in. I'm going to ask that athlete, how did that feel? It felt a normal easy run, and I can come back and do my workout the next day. Okay, this is again an anomaly. This is not most people, but this is why I like to use those three things. Their pacing based on VO2 max, their heart rate, and their perceived effort. And I'm looking at all those things. If something's a little bit off, no big deal. But if one thing's off, it can allow you to have a conversation about, again, stress at work. Are you feeling a little sick? Is there something, is sleep not been good? There's other indicators. We'll do a video at some point about recovery and things, heart rate variability are really interesting. Some new science coming out on that. But that's really where I have to take all of these things together and realize that there's no hard set rules for an athlete, right? You might have somebody that has a little bit more of an abundance of fast twitch anaerobic fibers. They might get naturally a slightly higher heart rate. Where if you have somebody that's an aerobic monster that loves the easy stuff, they might be sitting at 122, 125 for their easy runs. And it's just because of what makes all of us a little bit individual. And that's why I find training science to be so great. There are these rules, but then you have to play around with it and make sure that it works for the actual person with all of this. But that's why I'm using all three. I don't just using one. I don't think that's enough data points. Because if I had, for example, if I'm just using heart rate on that athlete that I was talking about, I would have had her slow down so much. Again, this is a female athlete that's going under 255 in a marathon. We're talking under 640 pace for their race effort. I would have made them slow down in an inappropriate way if I was just looking at their heart rate. So that's why I really like to look at all these different things, different approaches for it. And there are some people that are scared of a VO2 max test. It sounds kind of scary, but the more you do it, the more you talk about why, knowing why all of this stuff is important. I think that's a really key thing to deal with all of these different things when you're setting these intensities for somebody. Why are we doing this workout? Back to the first thing we talked about. What are we trying to train? Let's make sure we're actually training it and making sure we have these different data points so that we can best help you reach your goals.
Yeah. No, I think that's great using all three. Obviously, I would say VO2. I'm not, obviously in the training world with on the physical therapy rehab side, right? And I do ask, there's some people who do VO2 max testing or they've had testing done. I would say majority of people I meet, unless they have a coach, have not, or not even sure what that is, except their watch is telling them what their
Right.
VO2 max is. And I don't know the accuracy of that, right? Compared to going through the actual test. There's a lab around us, which I want to get over there and just see what they do. I saw somewhere that they do VO2 max testing, and I'm like, well, does that mean it's instrumented, just a very detailed testing, or is it you're taking them through a simple increasing the speed, and they're getting into their max out run? So, do you ever have anyone that you will send over, or do you have something like that near you to do lactate threshold, or just get a little bit more of a, I guess, a scientific approach to it?
Yeah. That's a great question, Julie, because there is actually, I live very close to the University of South Florida that has a great performance lab. And to your question, typically when you're doing the difference between what I'm talking about, a field test, which is, running 10 minutes as hard as you can versus a lab test is going to give you different data points that should allow all of this to though align. So basically when you're going and you're doing a lab test, typically you're going to be indoors, not in a field, and they're going to put some sort of device on your face that's going to be measuring the amount of oxygen that you're breathing in versus out, right? And so what they're going to do is go through a series of increasing intensities to figure out when you're breathing in and out, as you go from one level to the next, the same amount of oxygen is going out because your body can't use more. We're always going to breathe out some of the oxygen. You can't get to a point where you're using all the oxygen that you're breathing in, even with crazy training. But that's what they're doing you've seen where they have like the mask on and they're going through it. There's different ways they can do it. They can do it just with pace. They can also do it by an incline, but there's different things that they're looking for, not just for that amount of oxygen going in versus going out to where it caps you're not using anymore. But there's another indicator that they typically are looking at is when does your heart rate, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. And at some point it slightly goes down. And that's actually an indicator. It's something else. Another way you can do a field test. It's a lot harder to capture that point. But at that point where your heart rate comes down a little bit, it's basically your body realizing, all right, there's nothing more we can do aerobically. We actually have to save a little bit of energy, put more of the focus into this anaerobic energy contributions from the cells. And so there actually is that little bit of a dip to just, it's almost like a slight. I always liken it's like in your car when you go through the different gears, and when you get to like the fifth gear, like the RPM comes down. And actually, as you go to each gear, it does that. It's the same sort of thing. You have to switch to a different mechanism or a little bit more reliance on another. Your aerobic system's still staying maxed out, but it's just sort of like, all right, increasing heart rate's not doing anything. We're done. We're capped in terms of the amount of oxygen we can use. So that's another data point that they're looking at. But typically, what you're getting from that field, the lab test, excuse me, is you're getting a number. And that number is the amount of millimeters of oxygen that you can use per kilogram of body weight. So a bigger person can use more oxygen. So if you're not using that for milliliters of kilograms per body weight, you can actually make it seem that somebody that's a bigger person has a higher VO2 max. So that's how they adjust it, because a smaller person, say a 150-pound person, is using less oxygen than a 300-pound person. Doesn't mean that either one is more fit than the other. So that's what that number is on your watch. That might say 58 or 40, whatever it ends up being, and it might rank you superior in your age group. That's a number you're going to get. Not really super great for training. It really doesn't do very much for me. I can't really do a lot with it, other than if I measure you versus somebody else, I might see somebody else a little bit more fit. But what they're also going to give you is those different paces in which you hit this. They can see, where did your lactate levels start to go up? And there's ones that'll actually do a pinprick and figure out how much lactate is in your blood. They have new calf sleeves that can measure it too. And they should be giving you in those lab tests the paces at which you reached all of those. Really good ones are also going to tell you where your heart rate was. So that can also give you an indicator. Is your heart rate pretty standard? Is it naturally a little higher, naturally a little bit lower? And they're great. Some are more or less expensive than others, but I'll say that there's a guy who I work with here. I think I may have referenced him before. A 62-year-old dentist who's been with me now for geez, almost 4 years now. When he went and he did a lab test, it was only 2 seconds difference in the paces from the field test that I had done from him 2 weeks prior. Very, very similar. Now, again, this is because this gentleman gave all out effort in both. So it was, again, if someone's not doing, if they, for whatever reason, can't do a fast field test or a lab test, it's not really usable data. But it was that close. It was that accurate doing one versus another. So if you're not working with a coach and you have the ability to go and get this done to figure out how to do paces, it's a great way to do it, especially if you think that that setting might allow you to get more effort, right? Because sometimes people find it hard to go all out at practice outside of a race. Maybe it's somebody who doesn't like doing 5K races or shorter races. They're just trying to get indicators for their marathon or ultra marathon or whatever they're doing. But it's become, both of these things have become pretty accurate. There's different protocols for this in terms of the field test too. If you're like at altitude, there's different ones. So that's why I say finding the right one. But for this gentleman, we found a field test that he can give as much effort as for this lab test. So it's really amazing though how close that can really be, and how really kind of key as something as intricate as going into a lab and doing all this. The coaches that have been doing these field tests for years are successful for a reason, and it's why that these have become sort of the standard protocol for this is all for aerobic paces, right? So anything up to and including, basically VO2 max is very close to your 2-mile pace, but any paces from about that down, you can get some generalities of what you could run your mile and your 800-meter in. But that's a key indicator too of these are for those aerobic workout paces, which is most of the people that I think you said you're working with. So if you get high school athletes that are doing the mile, the 800, the 400, you're going to want to look at some different ways to set up those anaerobic training targets. But yeah, the lab test is a really great way to do it, but it's certainly not the only way to do it. Again, these protocols are pretty close, and it is a lot cheaper than going into a lab and scheduling this stuff too, if for whatever reason you can't do that or wouldn't like that setting.
Yeah. Interesting. So I wonder if the coaches on the high school level or college level, any coach, cross country, track and field, if they're doing, do you know if they're, I mean, obviously you've had experience in that arena, if they're I mean, I've always done testing in some way, just being a runner myself, but VO2 max back then wasn't really, I don't know, talked about and when I was running. But do you know if anyone is doing that kind of testing with their athletes? Let's
I,
say
I'd
high school.
I'd say the good ones are. I mean, but it doesn't necessarily just have to be from test runs. Obviously, during your off season, those
Uh-huh.
are your races, unless you have a local 5K. But again, you can do it the other direction, right? If you're in cross country season, there's standard conversions to get your VO2 max from a correctly measured, and this is always the key thing. Most cross country 5K races in high school are not the right distance. Here in Florida, we're running basically road races a lot of time because they're on school campuses and we don't have hills. You see some. I work with an athlete that's in Connecticut that she's been running 3.25 miles for most of her 5Ks all season, right? So all of those things being considered, if it is a 5K, you can figure that out. It's a lot easier in track because the tracks should be the correct distance, should be.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you have a 2 mile, you have someone's VO2 max within most reasons. So if you have their 2 mile,
Mhm.
that's pretty much the pace they ran their 2 mile all out. That's pretty much their VO2 max or close enough.
Okay. Got it.
3K is for some people a little bit different. And so these are all generalities, right? If someone's 2 mile pace is 20 minutes, then it's not going to be accurate. That's why I was saying 10 minutes is pretty close, which is why 3K could be right for somebody. You get a super, super fast
Mhm.
athlete that can run a 2 mile in 8 minutes. Their VO2 max is actually slower than their 2 mile. So you have to look at all of this. I talk about someone's 5K. If someone's 5K, and there's nothing wrong with this, but if their 5K is closer to, say, 50, 60 minutes, that's going to be a different percentage of their VO2 max. But those people that are in that where you would normally see the vast majority of people, you can do it with that for a high school coach. But I'd say the good ones, the ones that are really staying up on their coaching education, I saw it when I'm dealing with high school and college athletes, but it's not all of them. And the interesting thing is it's funny there's a coach that was here that's won something like 7 or 8 state championships. And I was talking to him a little bit about this at one point, and he had just figured out that if you run a 5K in this, then your easy pace should be here. And I reverse engineered his math, and it was pretty close. And it
Hmm.
was literally just more trial and error. He wasn't
Yeah.
doing the calculations, but he was successful because he had stumbled upon this in his way of doing it. And it was very, very close to what you would do in terms of a VO2 max testing. And I mean, the great thing about it is if you're at a high school, most likely you have a track. You could set up a 10-minute test. You can do it as a
Mhm.
mile. You can do it as a 2 mile. Again, there's different conversions based on the distance you're doing. But that's the great thing is it is so accessible. You run a 2 mile time trial with your team couple weeks into your season or before it and maybe set your varsity lineup, you can also use that as data for their paces. But what I would say is the ones that it doesn't typically work for is the people that are trying to pack run. You're trying to get your 7 to run with your 1 in cross country terms. You've got
Mhm.
7 people on a varsity team, people that haven't done it. When you try to get your best runner on varsity to run with your, at this point, not as good runner on varsity, typically this person is not training what you think they are, or this person's coming down and you're limiting somebody's growth, right?
Mhm.
So typically what you would want is the good high schools, they're not doing all of their runs together with variation, might be doing a warm up or a cool down where everyone's pretty much together. But if they're doing their long runs, their tempo runs, unless literally their PRs are all within a few seconds of each other, they should not be running the same workouts. And I'd say the best high school coaches, best programs are doing some aspect of this. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. That was interesting to dive into that a little bit more.
Mhm.
Let's hop back over to the heart rate side because
Yeah.
I actually ordered well, it should be here now actually, probably sitting outside. But hey, heart rate monitor because the most people go by the watch, but I wanted to test out the monitor myself. I really wanted to get it a while ago. I have been dragging my feet on it and see how it lines up with a watch because sometimes I feel when I run I could be feel pretty good at an easy pace and then my heart rate is up when I feel fine. So I was curious as testing it myself to see how accurate my watch is and then potentially using it on some of my runners when they come in the door. I don't want to make sure their watch is correct, but kind of the check thing. So what are your thoughts on a heart rate monitor versus the strap versus the watch?
Another fantastic question, Julie. So there's a couple things going on here with that. So again, looking at the variability for the person and their age and everything, heart rate monitors based on the wrist are notoriously inaccurate for female athletes. And hopefully I confirmed something that maybe you suspected. And that's
Yes.
for a specific reason. Again, these are generalities, but typically speaking, Women's bone structure right here sticks out a little bit more. It doesn't allow for really good contact. So
Mhm.
it typically does not give nearly as accurate of results. Also, my watch is really tight on me. It's not really moving very much. If it's one notch looser, it's also going to
It
give me less
moves.
of an, yeah. And so you're actually getting not only your heart rate, but it's sliding and hitting your wrist.
Mm.
That's going to
And
give you
Kyle, I don't
a,
like a tight watch,
yeah.
so.
So you're, yes, all of those. Yeah. So I would say that the chest monitor, or actually Koros, has come out with an arm monitor that's supposed to be very, very close as well. So all of
Mhm.
these different things, there's some new ways of doing it if the chest monitor is for whatever reason uncomfortable for somebody, which it can be. I've never really liked them, which is again one of the reasons why I've gone to the 3 tier approach for things. But yes,
Mhm.
these are not as accurate as people think they are, right? One thing that I also like to get people to do, if you can manage it, some people are better at it than others, is you're doing an easy run. You suspect maybe that this is saying that your heart rate's 150 something when it's not. You can just spot check it. You're running, you're doing this, 10 seconds, let it go. If you're anywhere from 20 to 25, you're between 120 and 150. And very
Mhm.
often I'll see that this is going up. I'll just spot check it for 20 seconds, or if you're at the water station, very quickly check it, however you want to do it. But that's another good way of getting, okay, you can probably do this for 10 seconds while you're running and it not mess you up so much. Just count the beats and see where you're at. If you're between 20, if you're at 20, you're at 120 in 10 seconds for a full 60 seconds. If you're at 25, you're at 150. So that's another way that you can kind of check it as you're
Yeah.
doing it, and a good way of kind of doing it. And again, if you're not going to do it for 10 seconds, all right, 5 seconds. You're at 10 in 5 seconds. All right, cool. If you're at 15 in 5 seconds, your heart rate is probably high, right? That's a good way to just sort of very spot check it as you're doing anything. But I do like that, for example, like I said, Koros has just come out with that arm monitor. I think that's going to be a lot easier for a lot of people to use. Chest monitor is definitely going to be more accurate than this. And again, with that caveat, if you're somebody watching that has sort of noticed that, if your watch is loose, you're going to get a naturally higher indicator, or it might not read your heart rate at all. Those are kind of like the two things that can happen with it.
Mhm.
And again, if you're most women, that bone structure sticks out just a little bit more, allowing for not the greatest contact on it. So it definitely can mess up your heart rate reading on that. So those are some of the things when you're looking at your heart rate in terms of how it's being read, how it's being monitored, and some of the cool things that are coming out in terms of heart rate monitors, because there is some innovation happening right now.
Interesting. Oh, thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So VO2 max, heart rate. I know RPE. I was touched on that, and you'd mentioned like the 1 to 10 scale. There's also
Hmm.
the 6 to 20. I'm just throwing that out there, the Borg scale, because I know some people might see that. I
Hmm.
probably use that a lot more in clinic. I mean, I go to 1 to 10. I've switched that with runners, but when I was seeing more of just my general population, I use the Borg scale more just to relate it to the heart rate. So, but it's one isn't better than the other, right? It's kind of what makes sense for you. But I thought I'd just throw that out there in case someone's like, well, I've been using this scale. It's the same
Yeah.
thought, just
Exactly. And
different.
there's more nuance there because there's obviously more numbers that you can rate it
Hmm.
on. Because I found that sometimes people might tell me, "Oh, I've been doing my easy runs at what I think is a 5," because they were kind of thinking that a pure walk or sitting in a chair is a 1. So making sure that you're on the same page, because this is something that is obviously it's not an objective, it's a subjective way of doing this. So making sure that you're on the same page with whomever you're setting up your plan with, or with yourself. But yeah, that I was actually going to say that relates it more to heart rate, which I do see quite often, and there's more variability because there's more numbers between 60, I'm sorry, 6 and 20. So definitely, what again, all this, there's not one right way to do it. If you came up with a color indicator for RPE, that could work. And it's funny, I actually kind of do that. I color code my workout types based on what we're training. We talked about that. So an easy run for me is green, because I don't know, green feels easy and cool, and a
Hmm.
fast intensity is always red when I'm indicating it. So you could even do it based on some aspect of that. I know that a lot of the watches and apps do that 1 to 10. So sometimes it can be accessible for people if they're doing a training log, but it does not mean that one is better than another, as long as you're on the same page of what a 10 actually is, what a 5 or a 1 actually is. For me, I'm usually trying to figure out it based on training. So that's why I say easy is usually 1 to 2. I'm usually thinking like a brisk walk is typically not
Mhm.
involved in that. And why I'm saying for someone that's brand new, it might be a 3 if we're just using RPE for somebody. But yeah, that's a really great
Yes.
point. There's different ways of doing it. It's just knowing what the scale actually is and being honest with what it is, as we've talked about with some of these other ones. Sometimes distance runners can convince themselves that an easy effort is something different than what an easy effort actually is, which is why I usually try to say 10 is a race effort, right? This is all out race effort for this intensity. So making sure that you're on the same page with that.
Yeah, yeah, because you don't want every run to be intense, right? I mean, you're not gonna recover and you're just gonna feel awful. So,
Yeah, I see people when they tell me that, and there's nothing wrong with setting Strava PRs if that was the goal for the day, but if the goal for the day was easy minutes and you
yeah.
come back and say I PR'd in my 10K, and there's reasons why that can happen. I've had people that during a regular tempo run because that was the correct intensity for the day, they ran in their zone. They are setting PRs because they've made that much growth. But if the intensity is supposed to be an easy run and you've just PR'd in your mile or something like that, something went off and you don't want to do that. So very good point, Julia. There's you don't want to be doing that unless it was the plan for the day.
Yes, yeah, that's anyone coming out of rehab, I'm always setting them with a 3 to 4 intensity just
Yeah,
to make sure they don't push it too much. Because intensity on my end is kind of the high intensity. I mean, that's going to be last, right? When you're coming off of an injury and you're trying to get back to running. So, yeah. So, also, well, this has been very informative, and I hope everyone else found it as just as informative as I did. If you're someone that is wondering, they've never touched this stuff and wondering kind of where to start, I would say just go out for a run and see how you feel. Can you rate it on that scale of 1 to 10? Maybe check out your heart rate and see what that's doing and start there. And then reach out to us if you have any questions about anything.
definitely. Yeah, and I love answering these questions from anybody who may have them. But again, it depends on the person, right? Which is the really key thing. What's right for one person is not going to be right for everybody. If somebody is just starting their running journey or restarting their running journey after an injury or some time off, that's perfectly okay. But knowing where you are today is the best way to kind of progress you. And that's the whole idea of having different training paces for anything. So, yeah, definitely having a good understanding of what these things are. Definitely shoot either one of us questions if you do have them about this. But yeah, really kind of knowing where you are today is the best way to take steps forward. I know I've said this before on the videos, but you want to take that next logical step in front of you, right? When you're running a mile, a 5K, a marathon, you can only take the next step that's in front of you. You can't take 5 steps at once. If you do, you're going to fall on your face. And the best way of knowing what that next step is knowing what step you're currently on.
Yeah. Awesome. I love that as a way to end it. Thanks, Kyle.
Absolutely.